and our collections manager, Emily Bryant, in making our program tonight a success. It is truly a pleasure to welcome back to campus Dr. Susan Stevens, Randolph College Professor of Classics Emerita, and to celebrate with her the publication of her most recent book, North Africa Under Byzantium and Early Islam, 500 to 800. Dr. Stevens received her PhD in Classics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison after completing a master's in history at the University of South Carolina. She joined the faculty of Randolph-Macon Women's College in 1993 and retired in 22?
I think so.
She has published numerous articles and 3 books related to the archaeological fieldwork she carried out in Guidonia, Italy, Lamta, and Carthage, both in today's Tunisia. Several students were lucky to travel with her to these field schools and to the Conservation Institute in central Italy, where she worked with Roberto Nardi. Dr. Stevens has not only been a dedicated teacher and mentor to her students, she was a generous colleague during her years at the college and was a force in helping to create the Museum and Heritage Studies program. The importance of Dr. Stevens' scholarly contributions is underscored by the awards that have supported her work, including an Andrew Mellon Research Fellowship in the School of Classical Studies at the American Academy in Rome, and grants from the Loeb Classical Library and the Journal of Roman Archaeology, to name but a few. Tonight's lecture will highlight the findings published in Dr. Stevens' most recent book, representing the culmination of years of fieldwork and research by her and her archaeological team. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Stevens.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Andrea, and in fact, you completely stole my thunder because I was going to thank exactly this evening. I'd like to especially thank my colleagues in Museum and Heritage Studies who floated the idea of this lecture, especially Andrea, who's the director of the program, and Emily Bryant, who's collections manager. But thank you so much also, Martha, for hosting us here, and Kathleen for her work, and to Wardrobe Mag for making sure that my PowerPoint presentation works. So we'll hope that that is the case. And I'd also, you're going to have to keep a kind of eye on me in terms of time.
We will.
So please do, when you start to, just, okay, all right, I appreciate that. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a little bit of background because I think, the title of my talk is actually the title of the book. And so it's targeted at a very specific audience, and I think it needs some description and background. So what you see on the left is a reconstruction of the Roman city of Carthage by Jean-Pierre Gauvin. It shows Roman Carthage in its heyday. It was a cosmopolitan port city, which had probably 500,000 to 1 million residents. It was the largest city in the Western Mediterranean, outside of Rome. What you see today of modern Carthage is it's in a suburban area of the modern capital of Tunis, which is what you see on the right-hand side. Oops, wait a second, I have to figure out how to do this. It was the largest sort of metropolis of North Africa. You can see it here. Here's Carthage, at least. Oh, I turned it off. Now it's on. I got it. Okay. So here's Carthage, and what you can see about North Africa, this is Spain, this is the tip of Sardinia, this is Syracuse and Sicily, which if that locates you right off, Sicily looks like a boot kicked something off the Mediterranean, so Italy is just about that. So it was a highly urbanized, very wealthy group of provinces, and partly, Carthage grew very wealthy on trade, okay, because it was especially well located in the Mediterranean as a port of call. And so, they had trading relations all over what the Romans called Mare Nostrum, our sea, right? And so what they were renowned for were the great estates which produced particularly olive oil and grain and wheat. And so they were a very important province. And the other thing that's interesting about North Africa is that because it's on the southern edge of the Mediterranean, most of the troubles of the 3rd century, and troubles even after that, affected the European provinces much more than they did North Africa. So it was an area of peace and prosperity throughout the upheavals of the 3rd century, and even onward into late antiquity. So those dates of late antiquity are ordinarily 4th through 6th century. So it was peaceful and prosperous. And in fact, it is that peace and prosperity that kind of drove the Vandal invasion. Okay, I won't say much about Vandals, I could talk a lot about them, but they are not who you think. Okay, so this was a Germanic tribe that had been settled in the Roman region for a long time. In fact, there were Roman generals who were Vandals by birth. So these were not barbarians at the gate, they were barbarians who'd been inside the gate for a long time. Okay, so, but they were motivated by finding a homeland. And as it happened in the upheavals of the early 5th century, the Roman army wasn't paying very much attention to North Africa, and it was easy pickings. So the Vandals moved in the early 5th century, and their goal for being there clearly was the richness of the area. And then, 100 years later, the Vandals founded an independent Vandal kingdom, and their capital was at Carthage. 100 years later, the Emperor Justinian, under other pretenses, decided to have the reconquest of Africa, to bring it back into the Roman Empire, which it was never part of the Byzantine Empire, but never mind. It was really an invasion rather than a reconquest in a way. But it too was motivated by the richness that was there. And of course, there's another side to the story, and this is where we get into the martyrial basilicas. Okay, so Christianity spread very quickly and early in North Africa, especially through the cities. With the growth of Christianity in the second half of the 2nd century and into the 3rd century, there were persecutions of Christian communities, especially clerics, in North Africa in response to the sort of challenge to the Roman state. And in North Africa, so there were martyrs. And the martyrs played a very, very important, the cult of the martyrs played a very, very important part in North Africa. And it's not clear, I mean, the martyrs were important all over the Christian world. But in North Africa, it seems to be related to the fact that, there are no biblical sites in North Africa. No apostles visited North Africa. And so it was very localized and focused, on these martyrs. So that's really what I'm going to talk about today. The interesting thing about, at first there were the persecutions by the Roman state, and then once the Christian church was established there were other kinds of controversies inside the church that also introduced persecutions of one set of Christians against another. So the Arians were Vandals, the Vandals were Arian Christians rather than Orthodox Christians. If you want to hear all about it, I'll tell you, but I don't want to take time doing that now. And then, of course, the justification that the Emperor Justinian gave for this conquest of Africa was to restore the Nicene Church. Okay. He wanted the land and he wanted the trade, but it came in under the guise of this idea that the Nicene Church needed to be rescued from the Vandal hordes or whatever. So there were 3 martyrs or groups of martyrs that were particularly associated with Carthage. And these were 3 martyrs or 3 groups of martyrs that were actually buried in churches outside the north part of the city. Okay, so this is the sort of city grid. And here are the 3 great martyrial basilicas of the 4th century. And then there's Bir el Knissia down here. And there's actually another one up here, wherever my Carthaginians are, wherever they are, who worked at Bir with me. So there are these 3 basilicas that I'm going to focus on in particular. So the earliest group of martyrs were called the Scilatani. This was a group of 28 individuals who actually lived in Numidia, but they were tried and executed at Carthage. We think that this church was associated with them. It's not entirely clear, but this is now called, I call it Dam el Carta, because that's the modern toponym for the field in which it's located, rather than being the ancient title of the Church of the Skeletoni, because we actually are not sure that that is the case. But this is a huge structure, okay, so it's very, very large, and its size really reflects the fact that it was designed for burial. So that's one of the arguments that I really want to make. I mean, the martyrs meant many things to many people, but in fact, I mean, for living people, martyrs were sort of role models, they were protectors, they were healers. And for the dead, they were the leaders to paradise, right? They were the leaders to salvation, as well as being intercessors, as they were, as the dead were lying in their graves in the churches near where the martyrs were buried. And so this takes on a very large role in Carthage. And of course, I'm actually more interested in the buildings than the martyrs. But the fact is that it's very difficult to attach. Oh, there are my Carthaginians right there in front. Okay. So it's very difficult to tie names which come from literary sources to archaeological sites, unless you have an inscription that says, "Hello, I am the Church of so-and-so," which doesn't happen very often. It did happen once. Okay, so the other two great basilicas are Emeritus, and this is actually a site which is associated and dedicated to St. Perpetua, Felicitas, and their companions. This one is actually can be identified as the Basilica Maiorum that we hear about in texts, the Basilica of the Ancients, of our ancestors. What you see on the left is a view of the Basilica Maiorum, or Emeritus Basilica, in the 1930s, when it was dolled up for the Ecumenical Council. And what you can see on the lower register here is the Church of Saint Monique. That is actually a neighborhood in Carthage. But this basilica was evidently, we think, was the tomb of St. Cyprian. He was a bishop, a very important man, obviously, who was martyred in Carthage in 258. But what you need to sort of get your head around, if you can, is how similar these two buildings are, right? I mean, so it's a long longitudinal hall with an apse at one end, usually at the west end, or westish end of the hall, with some kind of an entryway, a peristyle courtyard in this case, or a burial area in the case of Emeritus Basilica. These are very typically African churches because they have multiple aisles. Okay, so actually Dam el Carta has 11 aisles. I mean, that's a lot of aisles for a church. These have 7. That's still a lot of aisles, and most churches do not have that many. This is typical of North Africa. Why they do it that way, we don't really know. But that is really the focus here. So what I'm going to try and do now is talk a little bit about the field at Bir el Knissia, and then we'll get back to how that relates. So when we arrived to excavate at Bir el Knissia, this is what we had. A nice open field. No standing remains. Standing remains in Carthage are very rare, in fact. And part of it is because of this. Okay, here's the Bir el Knissia field a couple days ago from Google Maps. And it is still open, but you can see what it's surrounded with. And it's always under pressure. People always want to build on these sites. So one of the features of this project, which is really important to bear in mind, is it was not beautiful. Okay. Sad to say, it was a very important church at one time, but it's in fragments at this point. Okay, so there's very little preserved. So a lot of what I say is, trying to work through what the possibilities are for the fragments that we have. But it's a fascinating site at the same time. So I just want you to bear that in mind as I show you all these little pieces of things, because that's really what we had. So I'm really going to try and talk a little bit about this. And one of the reasons that the site was in such bad shape is because I had a predecessor. And actually, I'm very grateful in the end to his predecessor. This is Alfred Louis de Lattre, who was active in Carthage from 1875 to 1932. He did a lot of digging, okay? And he dug Damasel Carta and Sifa and Saman, as well as many other sites. He knew about Bir el Knissia starting in 1883, but he knew also where it was located on main roads, and he thought, this place is going to be a mess. I'm going to put it off until the last possible moment. And so he did. He excavated at Bir el Knissia in 1922 to 1923. He was a white father, as you may gather from his garb, which is a missionary order that was meant to bring Christianity back to Tunisia under the French protectorate. That's part of their goal. But de Lattre was an interesting guy. You can see him in his youngest years when he first arrived. And as an old man, standing in front of the White Fathers monastery, which housed the Museum of Carthage at the time. He was the first director. So he was also, with all of his expertise, or experience I should say, maybe not expertise, but his experience digging churches, he knew a lot about early Christian churches, but his specialty was really epigraphy. So you can see him standing here with a Christian tombstone, a fragment of a Christian tombstone, and the old chapel of St. Louis that was there before the grandiose, kind of Moorish, very strange kind of basilica that was erected later. So Père de Lattre was a kind of archaeologist that we don't particularly appreciate today because of his methods. But about Bir el Knissia, he usually published short articles about the sites that he was excavating. And he talked primarily about the size of the building and about the inscriptions that were in it, and not so much about dates, nothing about pottery and forget coins. Okay. So those were not his interests, right? He was interested in the things that were complete, that were beautiful, that could be put in a museum perhaps. Is a museum. So he didn't operate in the same way as modern archaeologists would prefer he had. In fact, with Bir el Knissia, he didn't publish any plan of the church. He published measurements, but no plan. But he did, bless his heart, he had his son make a postcard, which was published in 1923. And bless his heart, there's a postage stamp size map that shows you where the church actually is, which is kind of good. We now know that the plan that's drawn here is highly curated. It makes everything look nice and square, and everything's in order, and everything matches everything else. The walls are parallel. We know that's not the case at this point. But one of the great things about it is that he was the curator of the Museum of Carthage. All the stuff that he collected at the various sites he put in storage. So this beautiful column capital, which is, okay, I'm going to get the whole title out, a Byzantine bizentennial capital carved in Constantinople out of Croconesian marble. But what it is that's interesting about this is that it really is a beautiful piece of work. It's also imported. So this basilica, in a fragmentary as it is now, was a big investment on somebody's part. And so we were able actually to go through the museum storerooms and find the exact piece and photograph it. But the great thing about Père de Lattre is that, or I should say of the archives of the Museum of Carthage, is that this is the only original field journal of any of his excavations that survives. It is unpublished, or it was unpublished until I published it. It is, it's 14 pages of excavation that went constantly for a year and a half. I mean, this is not enough. This is just not enough. But it has lots of information in it, lots of little drawings, lots of details. And then interrupted every once in a while by, oh yeah, the guy came down and tried to sell me a coin. But it contains really important information, as well as being not what we would like, right? But it's still very, very helpful.
Could you zoom on this?
I'm sorry?
Could you zoom on this?
I don't know if I can zoom on this. I don't. I don't think, I don't,
Okay,
I'm sorry, it's beyond my capacity as a technology person. Okay, and so what you see on the right is a plan. And the two things were not kept in the archives in the same place, but it turns out that the plan is actually keyed to the journal. So he can say something about, oh yes, we have this tomb, and it's letter B on the plan. And I should say that this plan is not, this is a copy of the plan. Like a lot of archaeologists, when the excavation was in full throttle, the plan was drawn on like 5 separate pieces of paper stuck together with tape. Okay. So we decided it would really be better for everybody if we made a copy that was kind of viewable. So basically what you have is a building which is a sort of typical, maybe, basilica of North Africa. There's no apse because he never found an apse. But we know that the apse belonged here, but it had disappeared. And then there was some kind of an atrium, some kind of a walled cemetery here. But it didn't have multiple aisles. It only had 3, a nave and 2 side aisles. And I'm going to concentrate on this side of the basilica. But our goal was to put ourselves on Delatra's plan, so we knew where we were. And as you can see, we were really lucky. We hit the east wall in exactly the same place that Delatra did. Oh, and I should say, if I could just back up a second, you can tell his method. Okay, he started over here in the west side. He hit the foundations of the nave colonnade, and so we marched up the nave colonnade and thought, okay, we know how long it is. Now we're going to go across this way to find out how wide it was. This is called trenching. It's fast and dirty. You just go along the walls, right? But it does do something that stratigraphic excavation, it's very hard to do because it moves slowly. Do you know what stratigraphic excavation is? So this is like layers of the cake, and you have to take those layers. I mean, most archaeologists feel that you have to take the layers off in opposite chronological order, right? And you have to keep the layers separate so that you're able to date those layers, so that you can then date, phase, and date a structure. Okay, Delatra, he wasn't that interested in that. He wanted the plan. But without him, I wouldn't have a plan, because I have these little tiny excavations over here on the east side. And so we were able to locate ourselves pretty quickly. And so now I'd like to, I think it's time to turn to the sort of takeaways. Okay, so I think there are sort of 4 main takeaways from the excavation that are really important. The first is that there were lots and lots of burials in this church. Okay, I pointed out burials in the apse. There were also burials in the chancel, in the sanctuary. Those places are normally associated with holy tombs or clerical tombs. But there were burials all over the place here. And so this is part of my contention that these big churches were actually built for the purpose of providing space for burial. And the presence of the martyrs was very important for that. So what you're looking at here is the magnificent east wall of the basilica. Okay, it's about this high. As you can probably see, there doesn't seem to be much going on anywhere else. So I'm going to point you over here to, this is Chris Cohen, Chris's wonderful rendition of our trenches and superimposed on Delatra's plan. So we know that Delatra marched across this way, he bonked into, here we go, and he bonked into a burial, which we found. And then we thought that that's probably where he stopped, but it wasn't. Anyway, he dug a lot more than the diagram in the plan actually shows. But what I'd like to point out to you are these sort of dark spots. And you notice that the dark spots have lots of rectangular things coming out of them, and these represent graves. Okay, so what's remarkable about this site is, the way I always describe it, is islands of stratigraphy in a sea of disturbance. Okay, and the reason that it's so disturbed, apart from stone robbing and collection of antique souvenirs or whatever that people did in this field, the first intrusion on this site was grave robbing. because people were looking for valuables that might have been placed in graves. And the problem with grave robbers is that, well, apart from moral issues, the problem with grave robbers is that they find a group of graves, they go down into it, if they find anything, then they go sideways, so they don't even, so why should we dig from the top if we can just, tunnel underneath? And so that really is what's responsible for all the mush that we had at Bir el Knissia. So the other striking thing about it, you can't really see it too well, and I guess it's because of the lights, I should have said that. But the dark graves are ones that were dug into the uppermost floor of the church, whereas the light ones were ones from a later time. So there are 2 layers of graves, okay, and they're about 40 centimeters apart. Think about that. What do you think was the result? I'm not going to go there. But, I mean, there was an enormous effort made to accommodate more graves. So let me see. Oh, I haven't talked at all about this. Typical Bir el Knissia, right? This was a tomb marker for an adult woman who was 52 years old, so you know that this is only a fragment of it. So typical of Bir el Knissia because it's a fragment, but very typical of North African tomb mosaics. So because the martyrs were victors over death, that was one of the attractions of the martyrs, particularly around their tombs. So usually Christian graves had a wreath, which is a victory wreath, and inside is a sign of the cross, or the first 2 letters of Christ's name, a Christogram, and then around you can see these 2 nice little feet. They're bird feet, nice little red feet, which were probably doves that were in a heraldic position, because there's a pretty standard repertoire, as with a lot of tombstones even today. And then the woman's name and a bunch of stuff, which, to me just looks like probably good. But you give it to somebody who knows what they're doing and who's seen a lot of those, and they can make a lot out of it. And so this was a woman who lived in peace for 52 years and 2 months and some number of days that we can't determine from the little fragment that's left. And so this piece of mosaic was in the lower floor. It was the original floor of the church. And the original floor of the church was probably limestone pavement, which is very easy to lift to insert the grave underneath. And so the whole area filled with burials cut into the floor. And this particular mosaic, in fact, was under this mosaic. Okay, so oops, I'll just back up real quick. So in this area here, you can see the little piece of mosaic, and here's the large piece of mosaic that I just showed you. Okay, so, and I failed to say anything about date. Okay, so we could date the foundation of the basilica to 545, which is shortly after the Byzantine conquest of Africa. So it was under the Emperor Justinian this church was built. And then there were the surprise, so we weren't particularly surprised by that, but the big surprise was that in 570, at least in the East Aisle, actually all over the church, there was a new pavement put in. So the level was raised 40 centimeters, and a new church floor was put in, and immediately burials were put in through this floor. But here's the general pattern of it, and here it's a really lovely mosaic. It has very tiny, very shallow ones. Usually they're sort of cube-like. And so what the surprise was here is archaeologists had said, oh, Carthage in the late 6th century. There's something happening there. After Justinian came, nothing there. And this shows that there was a lot going on. In fact, there was a big expansion. And even more interesting is this crummy piece of mosaic, which you can see the burns on it from the collapse of the church. This mosaic was laid immediately over this one. There were only a very few fragments of this one, but they were distributed in such a way on top of that other mosaic that we could conclude that the whole floor actually had a new mosaic. It dates to 650. So if people thought in the past that nothing was happening in the late 6th century, how about the mid-7th? So this was very unusual, and we had dating material to support it, which is a really good thing. But one of the things about considering Carthage in 650 is that the Arabs, right, invaded Africa, came into Africa 20 years later. And we just assumed that nothing was happening in Carthage. It was just going down the tubes because the Arabs were coming. But of course, they didn't know the Arabs were coming, right? And life proceeded as usual. And so we have these three phases of the basilica. So I think, yeah. So then I want to move on to my second point, which this is my third point, is that bits and pieces of things matter. Okay, and of course, bits and pieces, you might say, there were 3,000 coins from this site. That's a lot of coins. And there were 1,000 architectural fragments that were more or less identifiable. And I want to show you exactly what that means, that collecting the pieces and collecting them carefully and knowing where they came from, you can get an awful lot of information. So this is what we in archaeology call a rock garden, right? It's a bunch of bush with stuff thrown in. But here we have two shafts, part of a column shaft of Pro-Canesian marble, the stuff that came from Constantinople. And we could match that because if you sort columns into size, location, and materials, you can tell which things went where. It's a laborious job, but it can be done, and I had a guy who was really fantastic at doing this. So what he did was sort all the different kinds of columns, and he was able to conclude that this column, so a Pro-Canesian marble shaft, a Pro-Canesian base, and a Cadell capital were the main, the colonnades that surrounded the nave, that was on either side of the nave. But we had lots of columns, lots of different sizes, lots of materials. And so we have the module and the module, as well as the column module here. And we also have little tiny columns that are more difficult to place. But so it matters, you know, to pick up the pieces, look at them carefully, sort them, and be patient because things do come together. Even little teeny tiny pieces. Okay, so for example, this piece is this piece here in a reconstruction of the chancel screen, also made of Pro-Canesian marble. And so this chancel screen, because the guy who did this, Fabrice Pessier, has seen many chancel screens in his life, there's a kind of standard, he was able to reconstruct what the chancel screen, that is the screen around the clerical part of the church, what it looked like. And it looked like many other chancel screens, but it was reconstructed from these four pieces. And then we had another fantastic piece of luck. This thing that looks like, I don't know, embroidery, but it's actually a bad photograph of a little drawing in Père de Latre's diary. He found this little tiny column capital. We found one in the east. His was in the west. His was adjacent to the west colonnade, and ours was adjacent to the east colonnade. And so what Bessier was able to determine is that this was a little column that served as a modillion between two windows, because we had window pieces as well in marble. And so he was actually able to say, in the end, he was able to take some chances, but also suggest that this is what the chancel looked like. Okay, so this is a side view, and this is a front view, and we're talking about the area here where the altar would have been. De Latre never found it, we didn't dig there. So we're not sure where it is, but it's somewhere in here. So we think that the chancel was raised, okay, and here are little chancel screens supported on posts. And then here are the windows in the side aisle and also in the apse, we think, somewhere. But what's really interesting is there was one column that was much bigger than the others. It was made of Chemtin marble, which is yellow, not white with gray stripes. It was yellow. And so quite a striking feature, which Bessier thinks framed right the chancel. And then the rest of the columns of the colonnade were slightly shorter than in the main colonnade, and they were Pro-Canesian, also Pro-Canesian shafts, but they had Byzantine bizonal capitals carved in Constantinople. So the chancel was much more elaborate than the rest of the church, as you might expect. So it's a very interesting church in that it's Roman on the outside and Byzantine on the inside, right? Because this is a really Byzantine, a sort of Byzantine structure in terms of the chancel. So the last part, and probably the most important feature for me, was a surprise extra building that Delattre found but didn't investigate. And that's this structure here, which is, as you can see, we just dug a small piece of it, and so a lot of it is projection to what we think it is, but can't be sure that this is what it was. There was probably more of it that extended a certain distance, but only about as far as here, because there's a porch out here that probably extended the full length of the church. So I describe this as a martyrium. It was chock full of burials. It probably had a holy tomb which has been lost. We have no trace of it. But it contained a lot of burials. And it had the same three phases as the main church. Okay, so it was built as a two-room structure in about 545. It was, and so I'm talking about this area here. And the first phase in 545, because of tomb robbing, there's hardly anything left, okay, anyway, there's hardly anything left. But one thing that was left was part of the floor, which would have been part of that limestone floor, which was pulled up in order to insert a burial for two individuals, one of them named Archaeologist, probably, an attested name, and Kalimera or Kalimeros. And you can see how much tomb robbers respect antiquities. Right through it. No need to stop, just keep going. And then in 570, like the Basilica, there was a huge expansion of this building. What was the second room, room 2, was actually made larger. A third room was added on, and mosaic floors were laid that match in the two outside rooms. So it looks kind of like a miniature basilica, but it's kind of truncated. But it has matching mosaics in these sides. And once again, we know very, very little, especially about the central room, because of the activity that was there later and because of tomb robbing. So this is a big building, actually. It's roughly a third the size of the church itself. So it's a pretty prominent structure. And we know that it was important because of itty bitty little pieces. Because we know that at one time it had, especially the central room, had a opus sectile floor, which is cut marble. So cut marble is cut into shapes is much more valuable than the mosaic, which is just little cubes. Right? It doesn't require anything like the skill. And also we know that there were pieces of intarsia which are like marquetry, but in marble on the walls. So it was more decorated than all of the rest of the church put together. So it was clearly an important building. And then in the third phase, they cut it back to only 2 rooms. As you can see here in Chris's wonderful drawing, you can see that there's this mosaic floor from the previous phase was maintained. But the room was split into 3 pieces, and this seems to have served as kind of a grand entrance into this room. The third room was suppressed completely. This became the back wall of the structure, or one of the walls of the structure. And a new mosaic was laid here in the middle, which looks like this. It's called a Solomon's knot. There were no Solomon's knots here. There's a little piece of Solomon's knot here. So it's a geometric pattern. Very little of it was left. As you can see, these little islands of stratigraphy, very skinny islands on them. But fortunately, underneath this mosaic was a coin, which is 650, and it was built into the foundation. So we're pretty confident that that is correct. There's a wonderful little story. And all this junk that you see, the burns are from the burning of the basilica. And all of this junk is there simply to support the mosaic to keep it from falling over while we excavated. And this is a marvelous story. So this little piece of plaster, this is a rendition of that. What it is it's an imprint of a tombstone, which was then reused for a grave at Bir el Knissia. Okay, so there was an original tomb which had its own inscription, which was then reused at this site. And what's important about this, and really striking, is that it refers to the burial at the tomb of of one of the Maier, one of the saints of the Maier. The Basilica Maiorum is Ansifa. So what we think is that this grave, the occupant of this grave, was translated from from Ansifa to Bir el Knissia. And that may sound strange, but we actually have lots of examples of it. In antiquity, people were moved from one place to another to be closer to the saint that was most important to them. So this new martyrium, I think it's a martyrium, it's really quite a striking feature. So I need to move on, I'm sure, so I will do that. So now the question is, what is the role of Bir el Knissia in the sacred landscape? And all I can say about this, and I'll try and be as brief as I can, is that when the Byzantines conquered North Africa, they wanted very much to make Carthage into their capital city, and they wanted to celebrate its heavenly patrons, right, the martyrs. And so what they did was add pieces on to elaborate the sites that were the historic martyr sites. And that's precisely what they did. Okay, so here's the church of the Basilica at Saint Monique. And here you have a sort of basilical-like structure, right? It looks kind of like a church. And it is associated with special tombs under the floor of a separate room. So this was called a funerary chapel. It certainly is a funerary chapel. But it is associated with special tombs. So I think a martyrium that was added in the Byzantine period. It's much later than the rest of this. And it actually has another structure underneath it, which is also later in the church. So at Ansifa, by the way, this is the inscription that identifies Ansifa Basilica with Philologist. It's a Byzantine inscription that says here are the martyrs, Saturninus and Saturus and Revocatus and Secundulus, and they finally get around to Philologist and Perpetua at the end, even though they're the most important ones, but never mind, it's Byzantine. And so this is what really identified the site. But what did the Byzantines add here? What they added was a separate little nave inside the nave, which included a confessio, an underground burial area for the burial of the saints. That's what a confessio is. And so this is Delatra's drawing of it at the time of the excavation. They also, what this colonnade, these two colonnades are doing here is not quite clear, but Bir el Knissia has them too. Okay, and so we can't really tell what they are, but this was a Byzantine, definitely a Byzantine addition. But I'd also like to point out that this structure here was a very early structure. Looks basilical to me, right? It has a nice apse, it has a sort of tripartite area here in front of the apse. The apse is actually centered on the wall, the entrance to the cemetery. This is probably the earliest site which was associated with the burial of Perpetua and Philologist. In fact, this mosaic was not found in the church, it was found right around here. So, it's a little hard to say, but besides the kind of elaboration of the historical martyr churches, you'll also see, I hope, over this few minutes, that there are architectural parallels, right? They're borrowing from each other, different kinds of structures in certain areas, and it's hard to say which church is borrowing from which, but it's, I think, a pretty compelling idea. And then at Damascus Carthage, the really big basilica, and I keep saying really big, isn't very specific. At Ansifa, for example, the hall alone is about 61 meters long and 45 meters wide. So it's big. And it's big to accommodate burials. And that's actually, I forgot to just show you. Sorry, coming the wrong way. All of these little black squares are burials. And at St. Cyprian's Church, the excavator just gave up putting in the little squares and just said, there's lots of tombs here. Okay. So at Damascus Carthage, there was a new building added on to this whole huge complex. And this is now presumed to be, or said to be, the Martyrium of St. Julian. It was built in 545. same time as Bir el Knissia. So it was specifically designed for pilgrims, right? So there's a kind of holding area, this nice sigma porch and courtyard, and then there's a very complicated stair system, which is clearly meant to direct traffic down to the relics and out the other side. And in 570, they expanded it by adding a second story so that the faithful could look down at the relics before visiting them. So in this case, the Byzantines built a whole new structure to sort of elaborate this famous historic church. So another church that I excavated with the help of Kelly and John is the Church of Bir which is, if you remember the map, it's way up north. And this could not be, its date is 545, just like everything else. And you know, Procopius, the Byzantine author, said when Justinian returned Africa to the empire and restored the Nicene Church, he built all of these churches everywhere. Brand new churches, he refurbished churches. Everybody said, that's impossible. He's just, you know, exaggerating for the emperor's sake. But in Carthage, it's true. Okay. Almost all of these churches have phases of Byzantine work or they're brand new churches. And Bir is a pilgrimage church. There are very few burials in it. It's designed for pilgrimage. It's designed for people to walk around things. It has this enormous baptistry, which is actually the sort of climax of the building. None of the other martyrial basilicas have a baptistry. So it's very unusual in its design. It has enclosed apse like early basilicas in Rome. It has, God bless them, the architect, a 9-sided building, not 8, not 6, not 10, but 9-sided building, which was the entrance building. And I always wondered, after the publication came out, what the heck it was doing all the way out there, far away from the city. And I have to say, I resisted this explanation to start with, but I really think it's now the case, is that this is the area where the basilica was, that we excavated the basilica, but there's this area here, which was excavated by Randolph. Okay. And in the 1895. And he said that this was a church, a Christian church. He identified it with what's called the Mesa Cypriani, the shrine of Cyprian. And we know that there are 2 shrines to Cyprian, one which commemorates his burial place, the other one which commemorates the place of his martyrdom. And so it's all very, you know, oh yes, well, it's out in the countryside. It's not in the city where he was martyred, and so this is a good place. And I just couldn't buy that argument because there was nothing to connect the two. But I think this connects the two. Because Byzantines didn't just add on to historic sites, they built a whole new one, a whole new big church to emphasize some of the most important historic sites. And Bir is one of those, and I think Bir el Knissia is too. So this site was excavated in 1912 very quickly. It was a mess. They just didn't want to dig anymore because it was just too awful. And there are 2 pages of minutes. That's it, this and this. But what we know is that near the ports of Carthage, there was a shrine to the local saint named Saint Agelaus. We have good literary sources that tell us that during the Vandal period, when the Arian Vandals closed down all the Catholic churches and replaced the clergy with Arian clergy, one church continued in operation. One Catholic church continued in operation. It was the Church of St. Agelaus near the ports. It must have been quite a large structure because in 525 there was a cemetery associated with this saint that we don't really know much about. And we know that there was a secretariat, so there was actually a big hall where meetings were held. There was a council in 525, still under the Vandals. The Catholics were meeting in council at the Church of St. Agelaus. So this church, such as it is about less than 100 meters from the Bir el Knissia that I excavated. And I have to admit, especially after the evidence at Bir that it probably is associated with the place of Cyprian's martyrdom, that Bir el Knissia, our Bir el Knissia, was also an elaboration of an early, very early important martyrial site. So Byzantines either put their stamp on things in a small way or they put it in a really big way. So that's what I think really Bir el Knissia does. So just to conclude really quickly, you've been patient, is that if you can imagine what the map of Carthage is and where those martyrial basilicas are, it looks like a pilgrimage path, right? And so gradually the information has been sort of accumulating that one of the things that Justinian wanted to do was make the capital of Carthage, his capital at Carthage, be like Rome, right? With all these sacred sites, and so that pilgrims would be attracted to come there. There's also an internal cities sort of circuit where the martyrs are represented by relics, not by tombs, because the tombs are only in the exterior, outside the city. So it's really the building of a pilgrimage area to celebrate, as I said, the heavenly patrons of the city and the bona fides of the Byzantines having taken that capital and made it even more a Christian site. Thank you for your patience. I wrote this talk and it was like an hour and a half long. I about all that stuff. So it's a local limestone, which is actually very pretty. It's quite porous, like travertine, and it's sort of grayish to roseate. So it has a kind of rosy color. And one thing I failed to mention is some of these capitals have traces of gilding. So we know that maybe they dolled them up. They actually painted some of them so that they would look, they plastered them over so they would look like marble. And in other instances, we actually have gilding. So there's. No. This is definitely Corinthian, but it's a smooth roof acanthus, which doesn't really look like a Corinthian column. It's much more simplified than that. Anything else? Yeah.
Well, when I was young, I knew the difference between a church and a basilica, but I've since forgotten.
Oh, there isn't a difference. There really isn't a difference. I mean, a basilica, in the Roman world, in the pre-Christian world, it was just a meeting hall. Right? But that's actually what the Christians adapted to their own purposes. Yeah?
There was a word you used referring to the anatomy of the churches, apse.
Oh, the apse. I'm so sorry. I just talk about this stuff so everybody. Don't you know that? So an apse is a curved wall. Right, and what it's used for in architecture, in Roman architecture, and certainly in Christian architecture, is it's to set off an area of importance, right? Instead of just a square, and it usually has some kind of a domed covering, which again is different from the rest of the church, right? The rest of the church may very well have roof tiles, like regular roof tiles that you see in the Mediterranean today, and on a wooden structure. And most apses actually have a slightly different arrangement. Not necessarily a dome, but some kind of a higher two-story structure, so it stands out. So not only in plan, but also in eyesight. Thank you for the question. I'm so sorry I didn't explain it. Yeah?
What does this mean?
Oh, yeah, well, this is the part that I wanted to leave out because I thought everybody was getting a little anxious here. Okay, so this is actually, I guess I should have turned down the lights a little bit. It was actually located here. It's a tomb marker. So not all tomb markers are the same size as the tomb. Sometimes they're just cut into the pavement. The tomb is underneath it somewhere, but it may just be there. So the guy who was buried here, his name was Wilhelmut. So, and there's another guy whose name is Hostrildas. These are not Roman names. Okay, so don't know that Romans actually adopted Germanic names of this kind, but it doesn't mean that it's available, right? So it's kind of disappointing because we'd like to say this is proof, right? This is proof that this church was operating during the Vandal period, but we know it was operating during the Vandal period. And we know that the Church of St. Agelaus was operating in the Vandal period. Yeah.
I want to thank you for allowing me to see what St. Augustine meant when he mentioned his mother, St. Monica, worshiping by the tombs of the martyrs.
Right.
And for showing me the two stages of North African Christians, the Roman and then the later Byzantine.
Right.
Is there an example of icons in the chancel or iconostasis that has been found?
Carthage.
Okay.
No. And the reason is just the conditions in Carthage are terrible.
I don't know if carved them or what.
Well, we just don't have anything from Carthage. And actually, most of North Africa, we don't have icons for North Africa, per se. I mean, icons are also a later development. There are paintings, there are wall paintings. And in fact, there is in Carthage an underground baptistry, which has a wall painting, which is actually of Carthage and Lamta. It's not a church. It's a baptistry, maybe? A baptistry without a church? Kind of weird. But there are paintings, but not icons per se. Yeah.
So when you said that the imprint of the inscription was from another place, are you saying that they moved a martyr there?
No, they didn't move the martyr. They moved the person who was buried next to the martyr.
Got it.
Okay, so what the inscription suggests, at least, is this 100% positive sure? But what it seems to suggest is that this tombstone covered a grave at Msifa. And then we assume that because tombstones are expensive, you don't just throw them out, you take them with you and reuse them.
So how did you get the imprint and not?
Oh, and not the stone? Because the stone is gone.
So you just happened to catch.
Yeah, in 34 pieces.
Okay.
In 34 pieces of plaster that somebody had to.
It's underlayment, right?
What?
It's underlayment.
Yes, that's right. So it was the surface that was meant to hold the stone down in place, right? But because it was a reused stone, it left a really nice impression for us. Because we didn't have the stone, but I'd rather have that, actually. Yes?
So when you were discussing the mosaics, you would often bring up how the top layer was burned. Do the fires have a date, like the burnings have a date? Or do they have significance?
The fire, unfortunately, fire is very difficult to date. I mean, yes, I mean, the whole site is covered with ashes and roof tiles is cleared and the whole complex burned down. And of course, it's after 650, which is the latest floor that we have.
So like the Arab.
Yeah, so we always blame everything on the Arabs, and that's not really fair. I mean, it could have just been a fire, right? But yes, it must be in the decades after 650. And I would say a good distance after that, right? A couple of decades, because there were lots of tombs that were put in under that mosaic.
So has there been anything found in between the last mosaic layer and the time of the fire-ish? Or was it just...
No. Nothing to date it, of course, right? Because what happens in a fire is that the thing collapses. There's nobody there throwing coins and pottery for happy archaeologists to find. So it's very difficult to date destruction layers. It's really difficult to do it. So much of this church is mixed debris from all eras. Not very much modern, but there's really not much of it left. And it must have been a magnificent structure in its original form. But all you can do is imagine it now. It's a corrected development. So nobody wants to hear the difference between Nicene and Arian Christian? Yes?
I think one of the interesting things that I discovered when we were talking to me about this was that when you dig it up, you put it back. And Delattre did that too, but not as nice and neat as he did.
Right.
But I was also curious about how neatly you have to put it back.
Yeah, well, certain things went back and certain things didn't. Okay, and the ugly fact of archaeology is that when you excavate, you destroy, right? So everything that you've excavated, if you don't publish it, you have no business digging it. That's one thing. Because it's all information, and that information is gone forever, right? And so the things that you collect, some of them you put back in the site, some of them go in a storeroom and sit there for a very long time, and then they get lost. You know. So the way you bring the structure back to life is by publishing it. It's really the only way. And then you can actually, and you know, I'm not saying that the story I tell about this church is absolutely 100% true, because I can't say that that's the case. What it is, and what I like about archaeology the most is it's like a giant jigsaw puzzle. I like jigsaw puzzles, and I like solving chronological problems. I like having little bits and making them into big bits, and I like making small excavations turn into a whole big church. So it's a fascinating process, but it's destructive. And I think everybody needs to kind of bear that in mind. And Delattre actually kept, his stuff survived in the museum for a very long time. Ours, not so sure. They just closed the Museum of Carthage for 5 years. They're moving all of the finds from excavations of centuries into another place. Did they take all the labels with them? I don't know. So anything that goes into storage is in danger. We leave the mosaics there. Okay, so anything which is in situ, we leave it in situ. Did you have a question? Yeah.
What is the difference between the Christians?
Oh! Okay, well, it's actually very simple, but it's also kind of arcane. It's about the Trinity. Okay, so the Arian Christians believed that the substance of God the Father and God the Son was similar, but not the same. And the Nicene Christians believed that the substance of God the Father and God the Son was the same. So it's the Homoian church, the Arian church, as opposed to the Homoousian church, which is the Nicene Creed. Okay, so, and you have to ask yourself, how many ordinary Christians were really engaged in this Trinitarian controversy? I mean, it was hugely important for the clerics, right? And there's also pretty good evidence that that there were large Christian communities that worshipped in these churches that were held by Arians. Did it matter? Not so sure for most people. And certainly in the case of burial, it didn't matter. They wanted to be buried near the saints. They didn't care much, I imagine. I mean, maybe I'm projecting. I wouldn't imagine it would mean that much to them, whether the clerics in charge of that church, where they wanted to be buried near the martyr, was Arian or Nicene Creed. So, but what's interesting, and I completely forgot to say this, is that there were actually persecutions, right? The Arians persecuted the clergy. And so we don't know who the saints are at Bir el Knissia or at Bir Tua, but we know where they were buried. And so we assume that these are confessores, martyrs, people who suffered under the Arian church. I completely failed to say that. Thank you.
One more question. When you say area, do you mean Indo-Aryan as in?
No. This is there's a cleric by the name of Arius, and he converted the Vandals.
No, I was just wondering, from.
Oh, no. That's it's spelled the same way. Not the same. Okay, thank you very much